Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading a new book called Dave at Night by Gail Carson Levine. This happens to be a book that I read to my students when I was a middle school reading teacher, and they really enjoyed it. When we moved, there were only about 4 or 5 books from when I taught that I kept with me, and this is one of them, and I'd like to read it to you. Dave at Night. First thing we do is we look at the cover and the title, and we see a boy, and he's wearing knickers. Looks like he is in the 1920s, 1930s, lives in a city. And then here is something puzzling. It says, orphan by day, Dave at night. And then we open it up, and I got a nice surprise, and that is I have an autographed copy of the book from the author. If you read the back of the book, that also will give you some information to help you when we start actually reading. If nobody wants him, that's fine. He'll just take care of himself. When his father dies, Dave knows nothing will ever be the same, and then it happens. Dave lands in an orphanage, the cold and strict Hebrew home for boys in Harlem, far from the life he knew on the Lower East Side. But he's not so worried. He knows he'll be okay. He always is. If it doesn't work out, he'll just leave, find a better place to stay. But it's not that simple. Outside the gates of the orphanage, the nighttime streets of Harlem buzz with jazz musicians and swindlers, exclusive parties and mystifying strangers. Inside, another world unfolds, thick with rare friendships and bitter enemies. Perhaps somewhere among it all, Dave can find a place that feels like home. All right, so I will begin. And here under the acknowledgments is an interesting thing. The author says, "To my father, the real Dave, and to my mother, you speak through me always." So, even though this is called historical fiction, the author of the book has named the main character for her father, who apparently was also in a Hebrew orphanage at one time. Chapter 1. From the start, I've always made trouble. My mama died of complications from having me. I once joked about it to my older brother Gideon. I said I could make trouble even before I was born. Gideon thought I was serious because he said, "You didn't do it on purpose, Dave. You were too young. You weren't even yourself yet." No, I didn't do it on purpose, but probably I was fooling around in her belly, having a fine time, and I kicked or punched too hard, and one thing led to another, and she died. I had nothing to do with Papa dying, though. He died Tuesday, October 26, 1926, when he fell off the roof of a house he was helping to build. About 4 years before he died, when I was 7, I got in trouble for smearing glue on the chair of Izzy the glass bully. My stepmother Ida had to go to PS 42 and promise the principal that I'd never smear glue on anybody's chair ever again. I never did, but Ida had to visit PS 42 often anyway. And PS 42 means Public School 42. In New York City, the schools don't always have names, but they have numbers. I batted a ball into our 4th grade teacher's rear end by accident. My aim wasn't that good. I fought with Izzy on the stairs. I let a mouse loose in our classroom. Oh, and more. Some things I didn't do but got blamed for because I'd done everything else. Papa tried to be mad when I got into trouble. "You have to behave," he'd say. I'd say, "Yes, Papa. Ida can't do her work if she has to go to school because of you." "I know." Ida made ladies' blouses on the sewing machine next to her in Papa's bed. "This is the end of it. Yes?" "Yes, Papa." "Good." Then he always asked, "What happened?" At the beginning of my story, he'd listen and frown, but then the frown would disappear and his shoulders would start to shake. A little while later, he'd be laughing and wiping tears from his eyes. Papa was a woodworker. Before he came to the United States, he made a cabinet for the Sultan of Turkey. The Sultan was so pleased with the 3 hidden drawers Papa put into it that he gave Papa a gold medal. Whenever he told about the medal, Papa would laugh. "We had to come to this country because of the Sultan," he'd say. "I didn't want any more work from him. If he liked what you did, he gave you a medal. If he didn't like it," and Papa would drag a finger across his throat, "too bad for you." He'd laugh some more and add, "When we came to New York City, I sold the medal and bought your mama a dress." But that wasn't the real reason Papa came to the United States. The real reason was too serious for him to talk about, so he'd joke about the medal instead. The truth was that there had been a war, and Greece had taken over the city where he lived. Papa and his family, the Kairos family, had sided with Turkey, and so they all moved here when Greece had won. The day Papa died, I was late getting home after school, detention, and then stickball. When I got there, Gideon was sitting on the steps outside our building. As soon as I saw him, I knew something was wrong. He was never out there. He was always upstairs or at the library studying. When I got close enough, I saw he had been crying. "What happened?" "Papa." I ran into the building. Gideon followed me. Papa was in the front room, lying on the couch, where Gideon and I slept at night. He wasn't bleeding, but he didn't look right. He looked like Papa in a photograph, not like Papa. His face was too white, with gray shadows under his eyes and on his cheeks. "Papa!" He didn't move. Ida stood at the window looking out. She didn't turn when I came in. Mrs. Stern from across the hall stood next to her, patting her back. "I hit a home run, Papa! We won the game!" I nudged his shoulder. His arm swung off the edge of the couch. His fingers dangled a few inches above the floor. I knew he was dead then, but I said to Gideon, "Did Papa break his arm?" And then I said to Papa, "I'll make you laugh so it won't hurt." But I couldn't think of anything funny. Then I remembered an old joke. What did the caterpillar say to the boa constrictor? "Dave," Gideon said. Mrs. Stern left Ida and started toward me. She was going to hug me and I didn't want her to. "No, listen, Papa wants to hear it. The caterpillar said, 'I don't want to be around when you turn into a butterfly.'" I laughed. "Do you get it, Papa?" I leaned down and said right in his ear, "Isn't it funny? Don't you get it?" From where she stood, Ida said, "Don't you get it? He's dead." Mrs. Stern turned away from Papa and held me. I stood stiffly against her. Ida went on talking. "In 6 months, we would have moved out of here. We almost had enough saved." I pulled away from Mrs. Stern and ran out of the house. Gideon caught up with me after I'd gone a block. "Where are you going, Dave?" I didn't answer him. I was heading for Seward Park to see if anyone was still playing stickball. When I got there, my friends were gone, but our stick was still lying on the ground. I found a ball under the Nash that was parked on Essex Street. "I'll show you how I got the homer." I threw the ball in the air. I swung at it. I missed. I swung again and missed. And again and again. Once Gideon told me to stop, but I wouldn't. I kept swinging and missing. I started to cry. "Why can't I hit it?" I said. "What's wrong with me?" "You'll get it if you keep trying." Gideon was crying too. "Why are you crying? You're not even trying to hit it." I laughed in the middle of crying, and then I connected. Crack. Papa was dead. The ball didn't go far. The stick, when I threw it with all my might, went further and crashed into the brick wall outside the boys' toilet. I crouched down and cried, really cried. I pictured Papa at breakfast dipping bread into his coffee, the bread making his cheek bulge when he chewed it. I pictured him before he left the house trying to kiss Ida goodbye and her pushing him away. I pictured him tossing his hat in the air and positioning himself under it so it landed square on his head. I pictured him saying goodbye to me and Gideon the way he always did. "Goodbye, genius," to Gideon. "Goodbye, rascal," to me. And then he went out, back straight, looking taller than he really was, looking happy, because Papa was always happy. And now he was dead. He wouldn't be happy about being dead. I stopped thinking and I just kept yelling in my brain, "Papa," over and over, and crying. Chapter 2. After a long time, I noticed that my calves were aching and I was cold. I stood up. Gideon was looking at the sky. "It should be raining," he said. Yeah, I knew what he meant. "Let's go home," Gideon said. "Ida will worry." She wouldn't, and Gideon knew it. Mrs. Stern from across the hall would be more likely to worry about us than Ida. President Coolidge would be more likely to worry about us than Ida. When we got home, the apartment was empty. Ida wasn't there, and Papa was gone too. "Gideon," I said, "maybe he wasn't dead. Maybe he woke up." I pictured it. Papa sits up, he groans. "What happened? I feel like a sack of potatoes." He looks around for us. "Where are Dave and Gideon?" Ida says, "How should I know? We thought you were dead." And Papa says, "Dead? I'm not dead." He laughs, and I'd feel better if I were dead. Gideon said, "He's dead. He broke his neck." Ida came in. They took him to the funeral home. We'll bury him tomorrow. She went to the icebox, took out a bowl covered with dish rag, and then what? After the funeral, then what? Then what? Papa would stay dead and be dead forever. I didn't pay attention to the rabbi during the funeral. I counted 34 people. Our neighbors, my aunts and uncles, and some people I didn't know who were probably older cousins. The cousins who were around my age weren't there. I guess they were in school. The rabbi's eyebrows were so bushy they stuck out an inch in front of his face. I was sitting next to Ida. Her bony hands were folded in her lap. She stared at the rabbi and never moved. Papa must hate being up there in the coffin, I thought, not even able to wink at the relatives who came to stare at him. The cemetery was in Queens. We followed the hearse in a Packard limousine. It was the first time I'd ever been in an automobile. I'd never been to Queens before either. It was the first time for a lot of things. My first time in a cemetery, the first time for burying my father. I wish I could see how fast we were going, but the driver was hunched over the speedometer. "Do you think we're going 40? I whispered to Gideon as streets and houses whooshed past us. He just stared out the window. Ida sat looking into her lap. Unless she did it while I was asleep, she hadn't cried for Papa. I looked around the inside of the car. The floor was covered with dark green carpet, and the walls were covered with dark green cloth. I reached across to the back of the chauffeur's seat, folded out the jump seat. Ida ignored me. Gideon watched, then turned back to the window. I crossed over and sat down. I figured I might never have another chance. I liked the way 2nd Avenue looked, flying backwards away from me. I wondered if hearses came this way often. Up Coffin Avenue, right turn on Corp Street, continue down Goner Row, left turn to Dead Man Boulevard. At 23rd Street, we went under the L, and we stayed under it all the way across the Queensboro Bridge. A train thundered above us as we crossed. It shook the bridge and rattled my teeth. Queens didn't look like part of New York City. It had a lot of empty fields and wooden houses. Hey, look at that, a yard full of tombstones. The Riley Brothers Tombstone Factory. Dead people were big business in Queens. I turned around to look out the front window. Ahead of us, the hearse rolled on, feeling right at home. A few minutes later, we turned and drove into the cemetery. And the car next to a The car stopped next to a freshly dug hole, and we got out. I stamped my feet to stay warm while the rabbi said a prayer. After they lowered the coffin into the hole, we all had to throw dirt on it. I wouldn't have been able to do it, except I pretended Papa wasn't in there. The coffin had a pair of huge, long shoes. It didn't matter throwing dirt on shoes. He's pretending his father's body is not there. Aunt Sarah, who was standing near the doorway, hugged Gideon and then me. She kept an arm around my shoulder while she said, "I can't believe Abe's dead. He should be here." Uncle Jack, who was visiting from Chicago where he lived, said, "He had such a brain. He could add a column of figures in his head and come out right every time." Uncle Jack put his hand on Gideon's head. "This genius can probably add 2 columns. Uncle Jack was Gideon's favorite relative. Gideon had been heartbroken when he moved away last year. I left Aunt Sarah and wandered between the clumps of people listening. I heard about a banana eating contest Papa had once won. I heard what an artist he was, how perfect everything he made was. They told the story about the Sultan in the Middle again. Aunt Lily was telling about the time Papa had brought a goat to school. She was my mama's sister. She and Aunt Sarah, Papa's sister, boarded with a family a few blocks from us. I heard a bang. Everyone stopped talking. Across the room, Ida was pounding her fist against the wall. Plaster trickled down from the ceiling onto the sofa. "Abe's dead!" she yelled. "Who cares what happened 25 years ago?" She banged the wall again. "I can't keep the boys." Bang. "I can't feed them." She stopped pounding. "Who wants them?" She was giving us away, as if she owned us. "I don't want my hat anymore. Who's interested? I don't want Gideon and Dave anymore. Who's interested?" Where was Gideon? I looked for Uncle Jack. There he was, pressing a chunk of ice to his temple for the headache he always had. Gideon stood next to him. We stared at each other. "Don't talk that way," Aunt Sarah said. "You and Abe had savings. You'll manage." Uncle Milt said, "Gideon and Dave will help, and you'll find more boarders soon." Till last month, 3 brothers, Cy, Al, and Max Rubino, had slept on mats in the front room with Gideon and me, but then they'd moved to their own apartment in the Bronx. "How many boarders can I take?" Ida shouted. "The savings won't last. You try feeding 2 boys on what I earn. Who wants them?" Nobody said anything. Then Aunt Sarah said there wasn't any room where she and Aunt Lily lived. Cousin Melvin said he was out of work and out of money. Uncle Milton and Aunt Fanny were too sick. Great Aunt Ray was too old. Uncle Irving had 7 children already. Then Uncle Jack said, "Gideon can come home with me." "Gideon? What about me?" "Who'll take Dave?" Ida said. Gideon whispered something to Uncle Jack. He shook his head. It was quiet again. Then Aunt Lily began to whisper to Aunt Sarah. I knew it was about me, but I didn't want to live with them and the whole Cohen family. I wanted to go with Gideon. Aunt Lily stopped whispering and didn't say they'd take me. Nobody wanted me. Well, I didn't want them either, or Ida. I walked across the room toward the kitchen. I didn't want to stay in there with everybody. As I left, I heard Aunt Sarah say, "If you give him up, Ida, he'll have a hard time." What does she mean, give me up? If nobody wanted me, who would she give me to? Well, that's a good question. And this was a fairly common thing in the 1920s and 1930s. Parents dying early, or one parent dying and the other one not being able to take care of the children. So this was a time when orphanages flourished, where children went who needed care. And that's where Dave is probably headed, also to an orphanage. See you next time. Bye-bye.